James Allison has done the best work of any commentator that I've seen on this story, so I'm going to draw on him quite a bit today, as I did last week. He said the purpose of this chapter, the whole story, is determined by the debate about sin, sight, blindness, and judgment, within which it is set. These are the jeweler's artwork, which show forth and make sense of the gem of the healing. So there's more going on than just a healing in these four areas particularly: sin, sight, blindness, and judgment. And we'll see today, hopefully if everything hangs together, what's going on with those four things. Just to quickly recap where we were last week, Jesus happens on this man who'd been born blind. His disciples ask him a leading question, an important question. They said, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should have been born blind? Jesus' response was, no one sinned, but just that the glory of God would be shown in him. So Jesus is overturning a long-held paradigm or belief that they had. And it started way back with Moses in Deuteronomy when it's written that if somebody is blind, it's because they're a sinner and they're under the curse from God. So whenever in this time period people would see somebody who was blind, they would assume, based on Scripture, based on the Torah, that he or maybe somebody in his ancestry had done something sinful and God was visiting this blindness on them as a result of that. Jesus overturns this idea in this story. He says nobody sinned, but God's glory is going to come out of this healing. And I think you'll see today that he was glorified in more ways than just the physical healing of this man. That's what's exciting about the story. I want to point out that this blind man, since he had been blind from birth, knew without a doubt that he was blind. It doesn't say that explicitly in the story, but you can read between the lines, right? I mean, there's no way that this blind man who was begging for a living would have said, if you'd asked him, are you blind? He would not have said, no, I'm fine. He wouldn't have said that. He knew that he was blind. He knew the deficiency he had. He knew that like we talked last week, that somehow creation was not complete in him. He hadn't completed his eyesight was not completely created. Then, after he was healed, some of the blind man's neighbors don't recognize him. This is a funny part of the story where he goes out, now he can see. He encounters his neighbors that see him every day, and there's a disagreement that arises among his neighbors about whether this was really the guy that was blind or not. And we pointed out last week that when God opens your eyes, like he opened this man's eyes, and he tells you you're not a sinner when you thought you were a sinner, some of those people closest to you won't even recognize you. There'll be such a transformation in you that some of the people that are even in your inner circle, the closest people to you, won't recognize you because of the work that God's done in you. It's not just speaking of recognition of his physical regaining of his sight. There's a lot more that happens when God opens our spiritual eyes too. Now, he was healed on the Sabbath. Jesus chose intentionally to heal him on the Sabbath. Now, he could have come back the next day and healed him on the day after the Sabbath, and Jesus did this intentionally numerous times. It seems like he wanted to bring this issue up, and he healed him on the Sabbath. So, because of that, the man's neighbors said, you ought to go to see the Pharisees. You ought to go to the synagogue and see the Pharisees and show them that you were healed. Because when he did that, and they inquired about it, he told them that Jesus had healed him. He told them how he'd healed them, that he actually spat on the ground, made mud or clay from the dust, put it on the man's eyes. Some people actually think the man didn't have any eyes, and that this was actually what we call an ex nihilo, or out of nothing creation. That just like God, we're told in Genesis, created us out of the dust of the earth, Jesus, again, in the same way, creates eyeballs even and puts them in this guy's eyes. Creates ex nihilo, out of nothing. We don't know for sure if that's what happened or if he just put mud on his eyes. Either way, he did it on the Sabbath. And this was a big deal because this was considered work. This was considered work in those times, and they weren't supposed to be working. To work on the Sabbath was to break the Sabbath, which was to break one of the 10 commandments. And that was a big deal. That was cause for you to be called a sinner and to be excluded from the faith community. See, the Pharisees are very concerned about drawing lines. They're very concerned about their boundaries, who is of God and who is not of God. So when this miracle gets done on the Sabbath, it's a big deal because it throws up in the air their conception of God. It throws up for debate now. If God, who told us to rest on the Sabbath, heals somebody on the Sabbath, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't compute. They're all about determining if you're one of them or if you're not one of them. If you're of God or if you're not of God. Who will they include in the community of faith and who will they exclude from the community of faith? So because they can't resolve it in their first meeting with this man, they call the man's parents. They're hoping, because they're actually looking for a way to unify. See, as soon as this man came and told them he was healed on the Sabbath, verse 16 says, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, referring to Jesus, for he does not observe the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And they were divided. So this is a really important verse. There is a division that's arisen among the Pharisees. And the Pharisees can't rule on something like this until they have unanimity, until they have a unified agreement on what must be done. So this puts them in a crisis. So they call the man's parents. They call it the parent trap. The parents come in. They're hoping that the parents will say, no, this guy actually had his sight. Or they'll say something to help them get around this conflict that they have. But the parents don't do that. They just say, yes, this is our son. Yes, he was blind from birth. We don't know how he got healed. Ask him. He's an adult. They do this, I think, because they risked being excluded from the synagogue themselves. If they were seen to take sides with their son against the Pharisees, against the religious establishment, they could have lost their privilege of remaining in their faith community. So they sidestepped the issue by just saying, ask my son, he can tell you what happens. They offer up their son in their stead to who James Allison calls the righteous just. The righteous just. These Pharisees saw themselves as the righteous ones, the guardians of righteousness, the determiners, the judges of who is righteous and who is not. They actually, by saying this, handed their son over to them, the gatekeepers, purity police, the moral minority, if you will. So this is the first attempt to resolve this disagreement, and it fails, and they call the healed man back. He comes back before them, and since they can't deny that the man was healed, they go to plan B. They try to get the healed man to say, this Jesus who healed me is a sinner. They say, glorify God. Agree with us that Jesus is a sinner. So what are they doing? They're saying, okay, keep your healing. We don't understand that. But at least agree with us that Jesus was a sinner in healing you because he violated the Sabbath. Now, you may not realize this, but in these times, as today, healing miracles are done by people that aren't Christians. Native Americans do healing rituals. Indians, people in India do healing rituals. So it's not a uniquely Christian ability to heal people through faith healing channels. It happens in a variety of cultures, has happened that way for thousands of years. So for the Pharisees to say, okay, I acknowledge that you're healed, it's not out of the ordinary, because they would have known of other people being healed. But this is another good reason to not automatically believe that somebody who claims to be a Christian and is able to work faith healings is actually a Christian. Jesus addresses this one time, doesn't he? He says, at the judgment, some will say, Lord, Lord, haven't we cast out demons and healed people and done all these things in your name? And Jesus said, I'll say, depart from you, I never knew you. So Jesus himself acknowledges that it's possible to heal and work deliverances, good works, but not be doing them through the power of God. Everybody with me? So don't just fall over backwards to every faith healer you see on TV and assume that he's doing it through the power of God. They ask him to throw Jesus under the bus, basically. And this would have been an enticing offer for him, because if he had just said, okay, I'll accept my healing and I'll discharge or I'll discount Jesus, I'll throw Jesus under the bus, he would have been accepted, where he'd never been accepted in his faith community his whole life. This simple little thing, okay, acknowledge that you're healed, but say that Jesus is a sinner who healed you. If he had done that, they would have embraced him with open arms. It would have resolved their problem too. They would have found unity together in that circumstance, and he would have been embraced by them. He could have then gone to the synagogue, had his sins dealt with through the sacrificial system, and lived happily ever after. But he didn't do that. What does he say to their offer? He answers, I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. So he doesn't make a judgment. He doesn't jump into the theological fray between these Pharisees to figure out, is this man of God? Is he not of God? He doesn't jump in there. He just says, I don't know. You guys figure that out. What I do know is I was blind and I can see. That is undoubtedly, without a question, a good thing. Wouldn't you say? Yes. So he's just saying, this is amazing. This happened to me, and I'm happy about it. It doesn't really matter to me if he's a sinner or not. You guys sort that out. And I'm guessing if any of us were blind, we'd be happy about that too. And we wouldn't have been all too discerning about how we got healed. He has no obligation to make a moral judgment against Jesus. It's risky to do this because he's not playing ball with the Pharisees. He's not playing ball with the religious establishment. He's essentially cutting off or risking being excluded again. So the Pharisees have to punt. They can't get him to agree that Jesus is a sinner. They said to him, what did he do? How did he open your eyes? Now they're grasping for straws. It's kind of like a murder investigation or an investigation of a crime, and you look at the evidence, and then you have to go back for a second look at the evidence to try to see if you missed something. So they're asking him again to explain how this happened so that they can maybe find something in the way he was healed that they can say, oh, that proves that this was a healing by the power of the devil or something like that. They can't deny he was healed, so they're looking for another way to get around this. I think I pointed out yesterday that the thing to recognize at this point in the story is how the Pharisees are responding, how they are seeking unity through one method versus another, and then another method. They're completely blind to. They're unaware that they're doing all of this interrogation in this particular way in order to find unity among themselves. It's kind of something that happens, and humans do this all the time. We're driven along to find unity in the groups that we belong to by opposing somebody else who's different from us. And we do this all the time. So that's where we left off last week. Verse 27, the man answered the Pharisees, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? It's kind of a cheeky response. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek response. You could take that either way. You could say maybe they want to investigate this further and actually really become Jesus' disciples. Or you can say that he's being sarcastic, and he's being sarcastic with them, and I think probably that's more likely. Do you want to become his disciples too? That kind of cuts. He shows no sign of intimidation. He actually, I think, begins to see through the Pharisees' game at this point. Up until now, the Pharisees have been pretty nice with the guy, pretty even-handed. They haven't threatened him. They haven't threatened his parents. They haven't insulted them. They've just been inquiring. They're looking for this way that they can get around this issue, this problem. But that's all about to change, and I think it started because of his answer here. Do you want to become his disciples too? That enrages the Pharisees. Verse 28, then they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. So the Pharisees here reveal their cards. They reveal their game. We are Moses' disciples. We need to remember this lesson today. Many churches, even today, are more disciples of Moses than they are of Jesus. I was more a disciple of Moses than Jesus for much of my life, and I was unaware of it. I didn't even know who Jesus was or where he came from. It is Jesus, though, not Moses, who is the exact representation of the Godhead. It is Jesus, not Moses, who shows us the Father. It is Jesus, not Moses, who fulfills the law by loving his enemies and not drowning his enemies. It is Jesus, not Moses, whom the Father told Peter to listen to on the Mount of Transfiguration. But these Pharisees now, by their own admission, said they were disciples of Moses, not Jesus. We are disciples of Moses, then becomes their statement of solidarity. their uniting mantra or slogan. We are disciples of Moses. So in the face of this challenge to their understanding of Moses and their understanding of Scripture, they retreat to Moses and Scripture and hang on to that. I don't understand this Jesus guy, but we do know this. We can unite around Moses. We're disciples of Moses. And then the most interesting thing happens. This beggar who had been healed becomes a theologian. He answers them, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. James Allison writes about this. This is really interesting. While the Pharisees are building up to an ever more rabid unity, in their midst, the one who is about to be their victim, on whom they will discharge their wrath, is becoming ever more lucid, giving weighty theological arguments, more fitting for a doctor than for a beggar. The eye of the hurricane is a center of peace and revelation, while the expelling rage builds to a fever pitch. The former blind man explains very clearly that the source of his cure can be deduced without difficulty. God would not have acted through Jesus if Jesus were a sinner. And of no one has it been heard that they could carry out an act of creation ex nihilo, or from nothing, except God alone. Whence it can be deduced that if this man did not come from God, he could not have done anything. The beggar is a theologian. The logic is perfect, but we're beyond the stage where logic matters. The most explicit revelation happens in the tornado of expulsion. The righteous just are no longer interested in arguments. They've got what they wanted, which is to build up their unity as a group, and they move from casual insults to a straightforward description of the former blind man as absolutely identified in sin. Because of this, he is a contaminating element, and they expel him. See, to the Pharisees, being born blind means you were born a sinner. And being born a sinner means that he must have been excluded, that you must be excluded from the community of faith. It's cut and dry, it's simple, it's easy. Ironically, the fact that the man is no longer blind should have removed the impediment for full inclusion in the synagogue. Because if he's no longer blind, you can no longer rely on the Torah to say he's a sinner. Because clearly in Deuteronomy 28, it says blindness is a curse from God for disobedience. But they're not interested in even upholding the law of Moses now. They accuse him of being a sinner. Who is the accuser? Satan was the accuser. Huh? Oh, here somebody's voice rises to the surface. The voice of accusation is heard. You were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us? Oh, there's the voice of Satan. And what's really important at this point? Look at this. The one who had been excluded all his life because of his blindness is now excluded again. But this time, he's not excluded because of his blindness. This time, he's excluded because of what he can see. He sees through what's going on. And he speaks directly to them in their terms, and they can't handle it. In other words, he tells them the truth, and they can't handle the truth. Quoting Jack Nicholson. He had been excluded all of his life because of his blindness, but now he's excluded again, not because he's blind, but because of what he can see. He can see through this whole process whereby the religious establishment vilifies people and excludes them from acceptance in the community. And then Jesus finds him again. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out. He found him and spoke to him. Do you believe in the Son of Man? He asked. So now for the second time in the story, Jesus finds the man. For the second time, While the religious establishment was busy excluding him, Jesus was busy finding him. In the very beginning of the story, remember, Jesus finds the man. His disciples ask him that question about who sinned. He found him at his exclusion in the first case. He finds him again after being excluded a second time. Jesus had given the man physical sight, and then the circumstances that followed to give the man spiritual insight into the blindness that the whole world suffers from. This is not just a Pharisaical malady. It's a malady we all suffer from. Jesus began, and he'll talk about this being the sin of the world. So John's telling of this story should give us insight into the same phenomenon. Only now does Jesus ask, do you believe in the Son of Man? Only now, after healing the man, and after all of this exclusionary encounter with the Pharisees, does Jesus show any concern for identifying himself to the man he's healed. Jesus he doesn't blow his own horn. He's not interested in that until the proper time. So at this point, Jesus sees some value in this man recognizing who he is. And he asks him, do you believe in the Son of Man? He didn't ask, do you believe in the Son of God? He asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? Why did he do that? Who is the Son of Man? You can think of the Son of Man as the true human, or the second Adam, or the last Adam. Hebrews speaks of him as the last Adam. In other words, Jesus is not only God, he is what humanity was designed to be. Jesus was asking him, when he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He was really asking, do you believe in the expression of humanity that I've just opened your eyes to see? Or do you believe that being truly human and in the image and likeness of God can be like this? And that to be truly human is to not participate in the blind exclusion of the religious gatekeepers. Jesus is drawing this contrast again between, are you going to be a disciple of a true human or a disciple of Moses? When I read this story, this is one of the first things that comes up in my thought. I need to think again, am I a disciple of Jesus in this case, or am I a disciple of Moses? Who am I going to follow? When Jesus said, follow me, he didn't say follow Moses, he said follow me. So the man responds to this question, do you believe in the Son of Man? In verse 36, who is he, sir? Asked the man, so that I can believe in him. Jesus said, you have seen him, replied Jesus. In fact, it's the person who's talking to you. Yes, sir, said the man, I do believe, and he worshipped him. Andre Ray writes of this, the first time this man encountered Jesus, he was a blind outcast. Now, for the second time, he will meet Jesus again as an outcast. From this and many other similar stories, it seems that the only context in which we meet Jesus and recognize him for who he truly is among the outcasts. Jesus himself was an outcast. And there's something about being an outcast from the religious establishment that opens your eyes to the whole game. That takes the blindness off of your spiritual eyes to what this whole thing is running. What is the machinery under this whole thing we often call the church, that sometimes is so distorted into an old covenant or a power structure, power over dynamic against people that are excluded or that they choose to exclude. In this text, we actually see the man having a progression of understanding about who Jesus is. When his neighbors asked him who healed him, he said it was the man called Jesus. So he hadn't seen him yet, because Jesus put the mud on his eyes, told him to go to the pool of Siloam and wash, and says that when he came back, he had gained his sight. So he'd never seen Jesus until this encounter when Jesus finds him the second time. At that point, when he's asked about who healed you, he says it's the man called Jesus. Then in his first encounter with the Pharisees, when they're asking him about it, He replies to them, he's a prophet. So he's gone from a man in this man's estimation to a prophet in his estimation. The second encounter he has with the Pharisees, he says, if this man, Jesus, wasn't from God, he couldn't do anything. You see the progression of understanding he's getting? He's moving from just seeing Jesus as another human being, another person, to a prophet, to somebody who was specifically sent by God. Finally, the man sees Jesus for who he is, and when he does, he falls down and worships him. Who is he worshiping? Moses or Jesus? He was worshiping Jesus. I'm not disputing Moses. Moses is an important character in the story. Moses helps get us to Jesus. But once Jesus is here, stop being a disciple of Moses, is what I'm saying. Now that we have Jesus, we no longer need to be disciples of Moses. He was just a stepping stone on the way. The religious establishment was worshiping Moses. They admitted it, didn't they? They were worshiping the law of Moses. Jesus, though, the true human, comes to open our eyes to the very system of blindness we're born into. And then the climax of the story comes next, in verse 39. Jesus says, I came into the world for judgment, said Jesus, so that those who can't see would see, and so those who can see would become blind. Some of the Pharisees were nearby, and they heard this. So they said, we're blind too, are we? If you were blind, replied Jesus, you wouldn't be guilty of sin. But you say, we can see. This was one of those passages when I used to read this chapter. Verse 1 through verse 38 seemed to be all coherent story altogether. Verse 1 through 38. Then when you came to this, it was difficult for me to pull this together with the rest of the story. You know, some of the statements that Jesus makes, you just kind of switch them, you pull them out of their context in the story because you can't see how they fit in the context of the story. So you think, oh, this is some broader concept that Jesus is trying to give us, teach us here. No, this is exactly the climax to the story. I came into the world for judgment. Now, we probably all have a pretty good idea what judgment looks like. We've lived on the earth long enough, some of us, most of us, to know what to expect when somebody says judgment. We envision a courtroom with a bench and a judge, and he's making rulings, he's making decisions, he's making statements that distinguish between right and wrong, between left and right, between what's in and what's not, who's going to go to jail and who's going to be set free. That's how we comprehend judgment, isn't it? We see judgment that way. And Jesus starts out this passage saying, I came into the world for judgment. But how does judgment work in this story? Does Jesus set up a courtroom, take his seat as judge, and dole out punishments in this story at all? There's nothing like that, is there? Jesus actually doesn't even engage the Pharisees in this story. He's somewhere else. But he says, I came into the world for judgment, so that those who can't see would see. You understand that? He gave sight to the blind man. And so that those who can see would become blind. Jesus, you see, judges the world by healing and including someone whom the world had excluded and left alone to beg. He comes into this culture where they saw people who were blind as cursed and needed to be excluded and kept outside the circle of faith. And Jesus comes in and judges that concept of religion as wanting. He does it by healing the blind man, who they had excluded and felt were sinful. By healing on the Sabbath, he forces the Pharisees to make a judgment about the nature of God. So here's some more judgment going on. The Pharisees looked more like a courtroom scenario, right? They're calling witnesses, they're talking to the man, they're calling his parents, they're talking to the man again. There's the world's way of judging. Let's pull the witnesses together and let's make a decision. Let's get in unity about this issue. And then we'll pass our judgment. But rather than admitting their own blindness and understanding, they found unity by claiming that they could see the truth. They knew he was born blind. I mean, the man knew he was born blind. No one had to convince him of his blindness. But the Pharisees thought they could see actually were blind. And they were unaware of it. Here's the difference. This man who had been blind his whole life was completely aware of his blindness. The Pharisees who thought they could see were completely unaware of their blindness. But Jesus is pointing it out to them. This is how Jesus judges the world. He judges the world in part by subverting our understanding of judgment, by giving us another definition of what judgment looks like. He allows those who think they can see clearly and make judgments that exclude others to blunder along in the dark until their judgments against others reveal their own blindness. So, there's a few lessons that I think we can glean from this story. Here's the first one. The story begins with an assumption that an act of sin caused a man to be blind and excluded. The assumption is in the disciples' question, who sinned, this man or his parents? But the story ends with a revelation that the blindness that causes us to exclude is our sin. You get that? The story begins assuming that an act of sin caused a man to be blind and necessary of exclusion. The story ends with a revelation or the understanding that the blindness that causes us to exclude is actually our sin. Remember what Jesus said at the end of this passage? If you were blind, Jesus replied, you wouldn't be guilty of sin. He's referring to, this is like if you admit that you can't see everything, if you admit that you don't know it all, you're in a place where you can have your eyes opened. But if you're so sure that you know it all and that you're worthy of passing judgments, he said, then you wouldn't be guilty of sin. But now, because you say we can see, in other words, we know what's right and wrong, we understand this whole scenario. He says your sin remains. So in the beginning of the story, when his disciples asked who sinned, this man or his parents, Jesus said, no sin in this family. But he says in the Pharisees there is sin, and it remains because they can't admit that they can't see. The story ends with a revelation that the blindness that causes us to exclude is our sin. Jesus is actually redefining for us in this story what sin is. The story is nothing less than a redefinition of sin. Here's what Allison says. Sin is the resistance in the name of God to the creative work of God which seeks to include us all. Sin is resistance in the name of God. In other words, we know what God is like. We know who God would exclude and who God would include. And we're going to resist the inclusion of this man because we know he must be sinful, because of something in his body that he had no control of. In other words, well, there's something about him that he has no control of, and we know that, but he's worthy of exclusion. That, Jesus is telling us, is sinful. That's what sin, Jesus calls sin. There's another one. Sin ceases to be a defect which excludes and comes to be participation in the mechanism of exclusion. Allison continues, God has not the slightest difficulty in bringing to a fullness of creation the person who is in some way incomplete and recognizes it. God has no problem healing somebody who knows that they need healing. Even today, you can't heal somebody if they won't admit that they need it. If somebody has a broken leg and they say, "No, I don't have a broken leg," it's tough to heal that person. We have to admit that we don't know it all. The problem is with those who think that they are complete and that creation is, at least in their case, finished. And for this reason, that goodness consists in the maintenance of the established order by the means we have seen. Goodness is defined starting from the unity of the group at the expense of and by contrast with the excluded evil one. This is what Jesus is exposing in this story. That the idea that we can sit in judgment over people as a council, we don't even realize that we don't see it all. We don't see all that's going into what's going on. That is what Jesus is saying in this story is sinful. One more. Sin is exposed as the blind act of exclusion itself. It is by the very act of judging, expelling, and of casting out by which these leaders who claim to see so clearly have judged themselves and exposed their own blindness. Ooh-wee. So Jesus has redefined or subverted what judgment means in this story. He's redefined and subverted what sin means. He's redefined for us what it means to have sight and to be blind. This is a fat story. This is a very weighty story. So what do you see now?